The day has done all it needs to do. Now only stillness remains. Let your thoughts loosen, like threads unraveling in the dark. What comes next is not to solve or to chase, just a quiet story drifting close. Perhaps it's a voice that remembers you, or a silence that has waited patiently. Let it meet you where you are, and let it lead you gently into rest. The snow came earlier than usual that year, soft as breath and stubborn as regret. In the little town of Evershade, the hills wore their white coats before Halloween even had time to whisper through the trees. Folks said it was a bad sign, the way the clouds had curled so low over the chapel steeple, as if heaven itself had drawn in closer to listen. Down Sycamore Lane, in a house with flaking green shutters and a garden long since surrendered to frost, lived an old woman named Delilah Roan. Some said she had once been a singer. Others swore she danced on Broadway stages. But the truth was simpler and lonelier. She had been a school teacher, long retired, with no family left but the rows of pressed flowers between the pages of her old books. Every winter, without fail, Delilah placed a single red rose in the windowsill that overlooked the road. It didn't matter that roses had no business blooming in December, or that the flower always looked freshly plucked. It sat there, dew-kissed and defiant, even when the world outside turned to glass and silence. The town got used to it, in that way small towns do. Children dared one another to knock on her door. Teenagers whispered stories of a lost love buried beneath the house, and grown folks nodded politely when she passed, not quite sure what to make of her. Only one person ever asked her directly about the rose. His name was Marcus Lang, a writer from the city who came to Evershade, looking for peace after the kind of divorce that leaves your soul in boxes you forget to unpack. He rented the cottage across the field from Delilah's home, where the firewood never quite dried and the floorboards always creaked a half-second before you stepped. They met one morning at the general store, where Marcus stood too long staring at tins of cocoa he didn't intend to buy. "You're the one renting the Williams place," she said, her voice like brittle leaves. He turned surprised. "Guilty. I hope you've made peace with the mice." "Still negotiating," he smiled. She tilted her head like a bird considering a crumb. "You're a writer?" "I try to be." Delilah only nodded. Writers don't sleep well in Evershade. Too many stories. And with that, she paid for her tea bags and disappeared into the snow. It was weeks before they spoke again. Marcus, curious despite himself, had started to walk past her house more often, slowing near the window with the red rose. It never wilted, never browned. It looked as if it had bloomed just that morning, even through ice-stung glass. On Christmas Eve, emboldened by loneliness and the half-bottle of whiskey he hadn't meant to finish, he knocked on her door. To his surprise, it opened. "I'm not here to bother you," he began quickly. Just wanted to say the rose is beautiful." Delilah looked at him, long and quiet. Then she stepped aside. The house was warmer than he expected. Not cozy, but alive in the way old things are threadbare, full of memory. A kettle sang low on the stove, and the scent of cinnamon hovered like a ghost. "You want to know about the rose," she said. "I guess I do." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the window, touched the edge of the sill where the rose rested in a simple glass vase. Her fingers, though wrinkled, moved with a care that made Marcus think of piano keys. or the way someone traces a name they miss too much to say aloud. "He gave it to me," she said finally. "The first winter after the war. Said he'd be gone a while, but that love like this doesn't freeze." Marcus felt the shift in the room, the kind that doesn't come from a draft, but from a story rising to the surface. "He never came back?" he asked gently. Delilah turned to him, not sad exactly, but emptied of something. "That's the thing, Mr. Lang. Some part of him did." The kettle began to shriek, but she made no move to silence it. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow as secrets. "He comes back every winter," she said, "just long enough to make it bloom." Marcus didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. And Delilah, perhaps grateful for that silence, poured him a cup of tea without asking. The rose stayed there through January, through the blizzard that knocked out power for half the town. Through the day, Marcus found an old letter buried under a floorboard in his rental addressed to a D. Roan, postmarked 1947, never opened. He never asked her about it. Some stories, he realized, weren't meant to be finished, just felt. By mid-January, Evershade had fallen into the quiet rhythm that only deep winter could command. Snow muted everything, the gossip, the grief, the half-felt hopes that usually fluttered through its crooked streets. Chimneys sighed into the sky, and the postman's boots left long, lonely tracks down the lane before vanishing into drifts by nightfall. Marcus Lang had stayed longer than he planned. His original idea was to spend just a few weeks to recover from the city's noise and the sting of a marriage gone brittle. But something in Evershade, the stillness, the cold, or maybe just the ghost of Delilah's red rose had settled into him. He started writing again, not about love or heartbreak, but about things that crept quietly through the world, things that bloomed without explanation. The letter he'd found in the floorboard had haunted him. He kept it in his coat pocket, folded into a square so tight the paper had creases like age lines. He never opened it. He couldn't say why. Maybe he was afraid it would say something ordinary, or maybe he was afraid it wouldn't. Delilah, for her part, had started to expect him. She never said so, but when he knocked each Sunday afternoon, always at 3, always with something like bread or apples, she opened the door with the resigned grace of someone who'd already set a second cup on the table. They didn't talk much about the rose after that first time. It was there, always there, gleaming against the gray of the world like a stubborn truth. Marcus sometimes caught her looking at it with a strange tenderness, as if it hurt and healed her all at once. One Sunday the wind howled so fiercely it rattled the shutters, and he found her sitting not in the kitchen but in the front parlor. The room had the careful neatness of a place unused but deeply loved. Dust clung to the edges of picture frames, but none on the pictures themselves. A man in uniform? A young Delilah grinning under a wide-brimmed hat. A small child with her eyes forever paused mid-laugh. Marcus hesitated on the threshold. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," she said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "I was just remembering." The fire cracked softly in the hearth, and the rose glowed faintly in the window, brighter than any flame. "He was a gardener," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Not a soldier, not at first. Grew things for a living. Tomatoes, mostly. Said they had souls if you talked to them sweet." Marcus smiled, surprised. "Really?" Delilah nodded. "He could make anything bloom, except time." That kept slipping past him. They sat for a while without speaking, until she asked, "Do you believe a place can remember someone?" "I think so," Marcus said. "I think some houses are like lungs. They breathe in everything that happens, and they hold it. Not always out of choice." Delilah looked at him then, eyes sharp in a way that made him wonder if he'd said too much. But she only said, "He died in Belgium, but he never really left this house." Marcus swallowed. "You've seen him?" "Sometimes," she said. "When the air goes still, when the rose starts to lean toward the window like it hears something." He wanted to ask more, but the quiet between them didn't want company. So he watched the fire instead, and tried not to feel the way the hairs on his arms had risen. That night, back at the cottage, he dreamed of the rose. In the dream, it grew larger and larger until it pressed against the window, petals fogging the glass. From behind it, a shadow moved, tall, indistinct, but familiar. Marcus woke with a taste of soil in his mouth and a strange weight on his chest, as if something had leaned close while he slept. The next morning, the snow had stopped. Sunlight clung to the icicles like a promise. But when Marcus walked past Delilah's house, he noticed something that stopped him cold. The rose was gone. No vase, no bloom. Just an empty sill and a smudge of frost where the glass had been kissed too long by life. He stood there, unsure whether to knock. Before he could decide, the curtain moved slightly. Not pulled, just swayed as if something had passed by behind it. But no one came to the window. No one waved. He went home and sat at his desk, the unopened letter beside his typewriter, like a heartbeat he could hear but not trace. And still he didn't read it. Instead, he wrote down everything she had said, word for word, because some stories, even when unfinished, refuse to disappear. By the first days of February, the town had begun to thaw, not fully, but in subtle ways. Icicles dripped like metronomes from the chapel eaves, and the pond behind the mill stopped groaning in the night. Evershade always softened reluctantly, as if unsure whether to let go of the quiet. Marcus, however, had become attuned to smaller rhythms, the sound of snow falling from tree branches, the way his cottage walls sighed after midnight, and the silence of Delilah's window, now empty. It had been 10 days since he last saw her. No rose, no light in the window, no footfalls across the snowy path. He thought often of knocking again, but something in him hesitated. It wasn't fear, it was reverence, perhaps like stepping into a room where someone had just prayed. Some spaces felt too sacred for uninvited footsteps. Instead, he buried himself in work, or tried to. The typewriter keys felt heavier now, like each letter dragged its own history behind it. He couldn't stop thinking about that letter, the one from 1947, still folded tight in his pocket. He'd unfolded it once, briefly, only to refold it just as quickly. It felt wrong, like peeking through a door not meant for him. That Friday, the mailman Earl, who'd been delivering post since before Marcus was born, stopped him on the road. "You been by Miss Roan's lately?" Earl asked, squinting beneath his wool cap. "Not for a while," Marcus admitted. Earl scratched his cheek. "Ain't like her to miss a delivery." Had 2 letters pile up in her box. Figured she was maybe under the weather. Marcus felt his stomach twist. "I'll check in on her." But when he approached the house later that day, something had changed. The air was warmer, faintly scented like turned soil, and the rose was back. There it was perched in the window as always, just a touch fuller than before, like it had bloomed from memory alone. No vase, just the flower resting gently against the sill, stem laid bare across the glass. He stared at it for a long time before knocking. No answer. He knocked again, then gently pushed the door. It creaked open. Delilah? Silence. The house smelled of tea and lavender and something older. Not rot, not mold, just a kind of stillness that had lingered too long in curtained rooms. Dust shimmered in the light that slanted through the window. He stepped inside. The fire was cold, though there were embers tucked like secrets beneath the ash. A cup sat on the table, still full, no lip marks on the rim. And then he saw it. On the parlor floor, beneath the shelf where her old phonograph still waited for music, was a single red petal. It hadn't wilted. It hadn't fallen. It looked placed. He bent to pick it up, but the moment his fingers touched it, the air changed. Warmer, denser, like the pause before thunder. Behind him, the floorboard creaked. He turned quickly, nothing there, but he felt it. Not fear, not exactly, just presence. Something lingering just beyond vision. "Delilah?" he asked again, quieter. Still nothing. But as he stood in the center of that quiet room, something rose in him, not dread, but a strange understanding, like being invited into someone's grief not as a stranger, but as a keeper. She was gone. Not dead, he didn't think. Just gone. Absorbed into the house the way old music lingers in walls. He left then, carefully, closed the door behind him, and walked home through melting snow. That night he placed the unopened letter on the table beside his bed. He stared at it long enough to memorize the handwriting. Then he slid it into a drawer. Some stories don't need to be read to be known. Later, as sleep finally began to drift near, he thought he heard music. Faint, warbled, like an old record turning in another room, and underneath it a woman's voice, humming. He didn't open his eyes, didn't chase the sound. He just let it move through him, like memory. And in the morning, when the sun broke over the edge of the hills, the rose was gone again. The second week of February brought a peculiar warmth to Evershade, one of those false springs that coaxes birds into early songs and tricks trees into budding too soon. Townsfolk stepped outside with cautious optimism. Children stomped the slush in puddle-worn boots, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus left his coat unbuttoned. But in the corners of the thaw, strange things clung like frost that refused to melt. Delilah's house remained shuttered. No lights, no movement, no rose. Yet each morning, as Marcus stood at his own kitchen window with a cup of instant coffee growing cold in his hands, he swore he saw footprints in the snow trailing from her porch to the field behind her house. Not fresh, exactly, but not old enough to be forgotten. And then there was the matter of the music. It came again, not nightly, but often enough that he stopped pretending it was imagination. Always faint, always just as he was drifting into sleep. The delicate scratch of vinyl and the lilt of a woman's voice, sometimes humming, sometimes singing, always low and sweet, like something meant for one listener only. One night, unable to bear the mystery any longer, he followed it. He wrapped himself in a sweater, pulled boots over bare feet, and stepped into the night air. The sky was unusually clear, stars stitched across it like forgotten names. He moved quietly, crunching over patches of ice, and made his way toward Delilah's house. The music was louder, now definitely coming from inside. But the windows were dark. The door, when he reached it, was once again slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly, breath catching. Nothing. No lights. No fire. But the music continued. Not from a speaker. Not from a phone. From the old phonograph in the parlor, its turntable spinning, needle dancing across a record that must have been sitting there for decades. Delilah sat beside it. Or no, not quite. It looked like her. The same posture, the same hands folded calmly in her lap. But she was transparent, faint as breath on glass. She turned toward him and smiled. Marcus couldn't move, couldn't speak. The fear he expected never came. Instead, something like understanding settled over him, quiet and vast. She gestured toward the chair beside her, the same one he'd occupied weeks ago. He stepped forward, sat, heart thudding like a slow drumbeat. She didn't speak, only listened to the record spinning between them. The song ended. The house went still, and slowly she faded. Not like smoke, but like a memory being gently tucked away. He sat there for a long time after she was gone, unsure whether the moment had just begun or just ended. Eventually he rose and looked around the room. It was colder now, dustier, like no one had lived there for years. A thin film of dust covered the furniture, the photos, even the phonograph. But on the windowsill, there it was, the rose, back again. No vase, no water, just the bloom, vivid and whole, as if time had paused long enough for it to grow. He left the house quietly, shutting the door behind him. By morning, word spread. Earl the postman found Delilah's body. She had passed peacefully in the front parlor, holding a photo in her hand. They said she'd been gone for over a week. Marcus didn't say a word. He attended the small memorial at the church, stood in the back, and watched as neighbors who barely knew her nodded politely and spoke in hushed tones about how strange she'd always been. But he knew better. He knew she hadn't left. Not really. That night, he wrote. For hours, page after page, his typewriter clacking into the dark. He didn't try to publish it. Didn't show it to anyone. He just wrote the story of a woman who waited, and a rose that bloomed in snow. And when he was done, he took the old letter from his drawer, unfolded it slowly, and laid it next to the last page. Still sealed, still silent, but finally no longer heavy. March arrived with a hush, like a child sneaking into a room of sleeping adults. The snow no longer blanketed the town, but lingered in patches, stubborn, shaded corners where sunlight refused to reach. Trees remained bare, brittle fingers against a pale sky, and the river that bordered Evershade ran high with meltwater, restless and swollen. Marcus found himself walking more. He no longer avoided Delilah's house. In fact, he passed it daily, not out of curiosity or grief, but out of habit, like one might check on an old friend's porch light even when they're gone. The rose was still there, though it no longer appeared every morning. Sometimes it would vanish for days, then return, unmarked and full. It didn't frighten him anymore. It felt normal, like something the town had always known and simply chosen not to question. He'd begun writing in earnest again, not ghost stories or memoirs, but something stranger. A novel that wandered through memory, place, and loss without ever quite choosing a plot. His editor would hate it, but Marcus didn't care. It felt like breathing again. One afternoon, while clearing out the attic of the cottage he rented, he discovered an old chest tucked beneath a tarp and a pile of warped picture frames. It wasn't locked, just latched with a rusted clasp. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Delilah Roan. Some were returned unopened. Others had stamps that had peeled away with time. One was dated 1950, its ink so faded it looked like a whisper on paper. At the bottom of the chest lay a photographed Delilah and the man from the earlier picture in her house. This time they weren't posed. They were dancing, somewhere green, her head thrown back in laughter, his hands at her waist, fingers splayed as if to memorize the shape of her. Marcus sat back on his heels and stared at the photo. She hadn't imagined him. He had existed, loved, left, and tried again and again to return. The next day, Marcus brought the chest to the house. He didn't go inside. He simply left it on the porch, wrapped in a flannel blanket, and whispered a small, "I'm sorry," into the wind. He didn't expect thanks. But that night, the rose was back. It glowed faintly in the window, as if lit from within. And beside it another bloom, white, new. Together the two flowers leaned toward one another, their stems crossing at the base like old friends meeting after a long journey. Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, blanket around his shoulders, listening to the woods and the occasional rustle of deer. Around 2 a.m. he heard footsteps, soft, measured, coming from the field behind Delilah's home. He didn't move, didn't call out. A tall figure passed slowly through the trees, too steady to be wind, too real to be shadow. It paused near the back of her house, turned slightly, and then vanished between one heartbeat and the next. He felt no fear, only calm. The next morning he visited Earl at the post office. "Say," Marcus asked, "you remember who owned my place before the Williams?" Earl scratched his beard. Before them? That'd be the Collins family, I think. Back in the 50s. Before that, maybe the Roans. Why? Marcus just smiled. Just chasing a story. And in a way, he was. But not one he wanted to publish. Not one he wanted to finish. Some stories he'd learned aren't meant to be resolved. They're meant to be remembered. And so, he left the rose untouched. Never picked it. Never asked it to explain itself. He just let it bloom when it needed to. And when it didn't, he waited. Because love, he thought, has a rhythm all its own. Even in winter. Especially then. By mid-March, the town of Evershade had begun to hum again. Children pedaled bicycles over damp sidewalks, dogs barked at squirrels that dared to return to the trees, and the smell of wet earth rose from the thawing ground like a long-held breath finally released. Marcus felt the change too. It wasn't just the weather, it was in the light, in the way it stretched longer across the hills, catching the tops of fences and the edges of rooftops in amber. It was in his hands, now stained with ink again, filling pages with words that surprised even him. But most of all, it was in the quiet, unspoken rhythm he developed with the house across the lane. Each morning, he checked the window. Some days the rose was there. Some days it wasn't. And on the days when both the red and the white blooms appeared, he left his cottage door unlocked just in case. He didn't know why. He just did. One morning, after a restless night filled with half-dreams of wind and humming, Marcus stepped onto his porch and found something waiting for him. A book. Old, leather-bound, its edges worn like sea stones. No title. Just a pressed rose inside the cover, flattened, fragile, but unmistakably red. He turned the pages carefully. It was a journal. Delilah's. Or maybe someone else's. The handwriting shifted halfway through from graceful loops to tighter, more angular script. The dates leapt years at a time, decades even. Some entries were no more than a sentence. Snow again today. He didn't come. I saw him in the garden. Just for a moment. The rose bloomed before the frost. It always knows. But others unfurled slowly, full of aching detail. Memories of laughter in fields, arguments over names for children that never came, dances in kitchens to songs no one else remembered. There was even mention of the cottage Marcus now lived in. He built that fence himself, you know. Said it wouldn't hold back the deer, but it might hold back the loneliness. Marcus closed the book gently, reverently. He didn't ask how it had arrived, didn't wonder who had placed it there. Some questions aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to open something inside you. Later that week, a storm rolled through sharp rain and rolling thunder, unusual for March. Trees bowed under the wind, and the river surged. Marcus sat at his desk and wrote with the windows cracked, letting the scent of wet wood and electricity fill the room. That night the music returned, clearer this time. The record in Delilah's house played again, but the tune had changed, slower, wistful. A song Marcus didn't know, but somehow remembered. It wove its way into his dreams and stayed there until dawn. The next day, he walked to the house. He didn't knock, didn't go inside. He simply stood beneath the window, looked at the rose, just one now, red, full, and whispered, "Thank you." For what exactly, he didn't know. For staying, for leaving gently, for reminding him that some stories don't need an ending to be real. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something in the reflection on the window. Not a face, not quite, but a sense of one smiling, watching, at peace. The air smelled faintly of roses, even in the cold. April crept into Evershade like a song remembered from childhood, quiet, familiar, carrying something tender in its rhythm. The snow was all but gone now, reduced to patches beneath pine trees and forgotten corners of porches. Crocuses pushed through thawed soil like questions, and the creek behind Marcus's cottage began to murmur again. One morning he awoke to birdsong he hadn't heard in months. He smiled before he even opened his eyes. There was something about spring that made you believe in second chances, even when you didn't ask for them. At the post office, Earl waved him down. "Got something odd for you," he said, handing Marcus a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. No return address, just your name. No stamp either. Marcus turned it over. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, looping. It looked exactly like Delilah's. He raised an eyebrow. "Where'd this come from?" Earl shrugged. was just sitting in your box this morning. Maybe it blew in with the ghosts." Marcus smiled, though something inside him stirred uneasily. Back at the cottage, he unwrapped the parcel carefully. Inside was a photograph sepia-toned, worn around the edges. It showed a young woman in a white dress standing in a field of roses. She wasn't facing the camera. She was turned slightly, looking back over her shoulder, eyes caught mid-laugh. It wasn't Delilah, and yet it was. Taped to the back of the photo was a note, handwritten in the same looping style. She always said love wasn't a place you arrived, but one you returned to. Thank you for walking her home. Marcus sat with that for a long time, not analyzing it, just holding it. That evening, he walked to her house. The rose was in the window again, vivid, as if plucked just minutes before. But this time it wasn't alone. Beside it, resting delicately in a small ceramic bowl, was a white petal he'd once seen on the floor. He stepped closer. There was something else. A small, folded piece of music manuscript paper tucked beside the vase. He couldn't help himself. He reached out gently and lifted it. Notes were scrawled in pencil, simple, almost childlike. But he knew the melody. It was the tune that had been playing on the phonograph, night after night. The one that had accompanied her presence. The one that lived in his dreams. Marcus didn't question how it had gotten there, that had stopped mattering weeks ago. Instead, he took it home, placed it on his piano, a forgotten relic in the corner of the cottage he'd never touched before, and, for the first time in years, began to play. His fingers were clumsy at first, stiff with disuse, but the music was patient. It unfolded beneath him, soft and steady, until the notes felt like breathing. That night he played long after the sun had slipped behind the trees, and as the final notes faded into the dark, he thought he heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, familiar. But when he opened the door, there was nothing there. Only the scent of roses, and the sound of something someone breathing deeply in the silence. As spring stretched its arms wider across Evershade, Marcus began to notice how everything around him had subtly shifted. The trees, once stark and skeletal, now wore veils of green. The air had lost its bite, replaced by a kind of sweetness that made you breathe deeper without realizing why. And inside him, something had changed, too. He no longer felt like a visitor. He belonged not in the loud, declarative way people talk about home, but in the quiet way a rock belongs to a riverbed, shaped, settled, part of the current. The journal Delilah had left him had become a kind of companion. He read it in small portions, careful not to rush, as if the pages might vanish if he moved too fast. He found himself speaking to her, sometimes aloud, sometimes just in his thoughts, telling her about his writing, his walks, the dreams that had returned. One entry in particular stayed with him. He told me once that the soul finds the person it loved most, again and again, no matter how long it takes. I think that's what the rose means. It's not a signal. It's a memory blooming. Marcus folded the page and kept it with him, tucked into his wallet like a prayer. On a warm evening in late April, he was sitting on his porch with a mug of tea when he noticed something odd. A group of children from the neighborhood were huddled at the edge of Delilah's front path. They weren't playing, they were whispering. He stood and wandered over. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. The children turned, startled, One girl with a braid nearly to her waist looked up and said, "She sang to us." Marcus blinked. "Who did?" "The lady in the window," another boy chimed in. "She told us not to be afraid of the dark anymore. Said it's where all the best stories live." The kids weren't scared. If anything, they seemed comforted. Before he could ask more, they turned and skipped away, leaving him alone with the fading light and the sense that the house across the way wasn't as empty as it seemed. That night, Marcus lit a single candle on his windowsill, the way Delilah used to. Not for any ritual, just because. And sometime after midnight, he woke with a start. Not from a sound, not from a dream, from a feeling. He got up, walked to the front door, and opened it. The air was still. No breeze, no song. But on the steps lay another rose. Not red, not white, pink. Soft and new, like something tentative. Like a question. He picked it up, held it in both hands. Its petals were cool, and there was a faint shimmer of dew along its edge, though the night had been dry. It didn't come with a note. Didn't need one. He knew what it meant. Things were changing. Not ending, just shifting. The next morning, the children passed his cottage again, laughing as they chased a paper kite across the hill. And as he watched them disappear into the golden haze of morning, Marcus smiled. He didn't need proof. Not anymore. Love had roots deeper than time. And sometimes it sent up new blooms when you least expected it. By May, Evershade had fully shaken off the frost of winter. Blossoms swelled on apple trees, bees wove lazy patterns through the air, and the roads once slick with ice now shimmered with early heat and dust. Porch swings creaked gently in the breeze, and window boxes overflowed with petunias and marigolds, hopeful and bright. Marcus had started sleeping with the windows open. The night sounds comforted him now. The chirp of crickets, the low moan of the creek, even the occasional hoot of an owl. There was a sense of rhythm again, one he hadn't felt in years. He wrote each morning, walked each afternoon, played the piano each night, and always checked the window. The rose continued its quiet rituals. Some mornings it would be red, others white. Only once it was yellow. He didn't know what that meant, but he accepted it the way he now accepted most things, with a nod and a breath. That week, he received a call from a literary magazine in the city. They'd heard he was back to writing. Someone must have mentioned his name in a circle that still believed in paper and permanence. "We're doing a feature on ghost stories," the editor said. "We thought you might have something new to say." Marcus paused, then replied, "Not the kind you're thinking of." He didn't send anything. Some stories weren't for publication. Some stories needed to stay in the air, carried by wind and memory and silence. On Thursday evening, a knock echoed at his door. It startled him. Visitors were rare. When he opened it, no one stood there. Just an envelope on the step, unmarked. He bent to pick it up and immediately recognized the handwriting. His own. Inside was a single page, pulled from the journal he hadn't touched in a week. He hadn't torn it out, but there it was. It read, "If you can feel someone watching kindly over you, let them. It doesn't mean they're gone. It only means they've found a better seat." Marcus sat down slowly on the steps, the envelope in his lap. The sun was setting, bleeding gold across the tops of the trees. The wind picked up, and with it, the faintest scent of roses, soft, not overpowering like the memory of perfume on a sweater. He closed his eyes, and in the distance the piano began to play. He knew no one was in the house, knew the power was off, but the music floated clear and gentle, like a lullaby meant only for him. He didn't run, didn't investigate, he just listened, and as the song played simple and unhurried, a figure passed by the edge of the field. A man, tall, with his hands in his coat pockets. He moved slowly, as if taking in the world one final time before leaving it again. Behind him trailed a shimmer of light, or maybe petals. Marcus couldn't be sure. He only knew he wasn't afraid. The music ended. The air stilled, and a single rose bloomed in the field where no bush grew. Summer crept in on quiet feet, warming the earth and setting the fields to golden waves. The days stretched long, soaked in honeyed light and gentle breezes that teased the curtains at dawn. Evershade, once a town trapped in frost and shadow, now felt alive with possibility. Yet for Marcus, the story he'd been living was far from over. He'd begun to understand something essential, that the rose wasn't just a flower. It was a bridge between time, between memory, between hearts. One afternoon, as he walked along the lane that led to the old chapel, he spotted something curious. A cluster of wild roses growing in a forgotten corner, tangled and unkempt, but thriving. Among the blossoms was a single red rose brighter than the rest, proud and solitary. Marcus knelt, brushing the dew from its petals, and felt the familiar stirring in his chest. It was the same pull he'd felt that first winter when the rose appeared in Delilah's window. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old photograph, the one of the woman in the white dress, smiling back over her shoulder. He placed it carefully among the wildflowers as if returning it to its roots. Days later, while tidying the cottage, he found a small box tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was a delicate silver locket, tarnished with age but still warm to the touch. It had a faded engraving, "To D with all my heart." Marcus held it tightly, imagining the hands that had once worn it. That evening he sat at the piano and played the melody from the manuscript again, slower this time, letting each note linger like a sigh. The house was quiet except for the music and the soft crackle of the fire. Suddenly he heard a whisper soft like the rustle of silk. "Thank you." He stopped playing. The room felt full, not empty. He closed his eyes and let the feeling wash over him, a sense of completion that wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Outside, the roses in the garden swayed gently, and through the window, a faint silhouette appeared, watching, smiling. Not a ghost, but a memory finally at peace. The early days of July shimmered in the heat, and Evershade settled into the steady hum of summer. The sun spilled late into the evening, painting the sky with streaks of pink and lavender. Marcus found himself sitting more often on his porch, letting the quiet wrap around him like a well-worn shawl. The story of the rose had woven itself into the fabric of his days, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a gentle companion on the road he now walked. One evening, a knock came at his door. It was unexpected. He opened it to find a woman, older than him by years but with eyes bright as morning. She held out a folded letter. "Delilah asked me to bring this to you," she said softly. "Said it might help you understand." Marcus took the letter with a nod, and the woman disappeared down the path as quietly as she had arrived. That night, by candlelight, he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was familiar, but the words felt different, wiser, more certain. My dear Marcus, if you are reading this, it means you have walked the path with patience and heart. The rose that blooms in winter is a promise love persists beyond what eyes can see. Remember that some connections do not fade, they transform. Hold on to that. Yours, Delilah. He read it again, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the journal. For the first time, the mystery felt less like a burden and more like a gift. Outside, the air was still and warm. The rose in the window glowed faintly, as if acknowledging a silent conversation. Marcus felt a peace he hadn't known before, a quiet understanding that stories like roses bloom best when tended with care. And with that, he closed the journal, turned off the light, and let sleep come. The summer days grew longer, and Evershade seemed to glow with a soft, golden light that held the promise of everything yet to come. Marcus sat on his porch one evening, the warm breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and earth. The journal rested on his lap, open to a page he hadn't yet read. The letter from Delilah had changed everything, yet also left a quiet space, a gentle pause between what was and what could be. He looked across the lane at her old house. The rose still bloomed in the window, defiant and radiant, its petals catching the last light of day. Marcus thought about all that had passed, the mysteries, the music, the whispers that had carried him through the coldest months. And he understood now that some stories don't end with a bang or a revelation. They simply unfold, like the slow blooming of a rose beneath the snow. The house was empty, yet full. The past was present, and love was something that, once planted, could never be uprooted. He closed the journal gently and stood, stepping onto the porch. The air was warm and still. He breathed it in deeply. The day has done all it needs to do. Now only stillness remains. Let your thoughts loosen, like threads unraveling in the dark. What comes next is not to solve or to chase, just a quiet story drifting close. Perhaps it's a voice that remembers you, or a silence that has waited patiently. Let it meet you where you are, and let it lead you gently into rest. Not all spirits seek to frighten. Some just wish to be remembered. If their tale lingered with you, let it rest with your breath. Sleep well tonight. And if you hear a whisper in your dreams, maybe it's just the end of the story. This story has reached its gentle close, yet its echoes remain, like petals drifting softly on a quiet breeze. If you found yourself touched by its quiet mystery, may you carry the calm it brings as you move through your own nights. Remember, sometimes the most profound stories are the ones whispered in silence, in the spaces between heartbeats. Thank you for journeying through the seasons with Marcus and Delilah, through the bloom that blossoms even in the coldest times. If the rose's quiet voice has spoken to you, may it accompany your dreams and ease your rest. And now, as the day closes and stillness gathers, may you find peace in the unfolding night.